But we begin with Canada-U.S. relations, particularly the state of affairs between our Prime Minister and the U.S. President Donald Trump. Now, things did take an abrupt turn for the worse late last night after the G7 summit. That is when Trump blasted Trudeau on Twitter, calling him dishonest and weak. Well, this morning, Trudeau was swarmed by the media in Quebec City.
Prime Minister, what's your reaction to President Trump?
Je veux remercier les citoyens de Québec d'avoir si bien accueilli les gens venus de partout dans le monde que j'ai bien hâte de rencontrer maintenant.
Your reaction to Trump?
And that was the Prime Minister responding in French. He brushed aside the barrage of questions, saying in essence he has no comment and must go to a meeting. His answer was all of 8 seconds long, Trudeau saying nothing in English and then walking away from the scrum. Well, the dramatic downturn in political relations began after the Prime Minister's remarks about trade and tariffs at a post-G7 media briefing. Today, on the heels of the President Trump's double-barreled Twitter assault, White House advisors joined the criticism of Trudeau. They did so on American talk shows. Here is a look at Trump's top economic aide, Larry Kudlow, on CNN.
It's a betrayal, okay? Essentially double-crossing. Not just double-crossing President Trump, but the other members of the G7 who were working together and pulling together this communique. You know, you never get everything you want. There are compromises along the way. President Trump played that process in good faith. So I ask you, he gets up in the airplane and leaves, and then Trudeau starts blasting them in a domestic news conference. I'm sorry. It is a betrayal. That is a double cross.
Well, with that, let's bring in Catherine Cullen. She joins us in Ottawa right now. So, Catherine, obviously the Trump administration really turning up the heat on Trudeau since his remarks about defending Canadian trade interests. We got a bit of it from Kudlow right there, but walk us through what's being said today.
Yeah, really, we've got to say, Michael, some jaw-dropping comments when you look at this in the context of international diplomacy that are coming from people around Donald Trump today. But let's quickly look at the backstory. So G7 meeting in the Charlevoix, Donald Trump leaves. He has agreed to sign on to the final communique, accepting a few particular parts about the environment. But once he gets on the airplane to head to Singapore, I guess he's listening to Justin Trudeau's news conference, and he is none too happy about what he hears the Prime Minister of Canada saying, sends off some angry tweets, says he doesn't want to be a part of that final communique. After all, he wants to pull his support of it. What's more, he says Justin Trudeau acted so meek and mild during our G7 meetings, only to give a news conference after I left saying U.S. tariffs were kind of insulting and he will not be pushed around. Very dishonest and weak, and that tariffs are in a response to Canadian tariffs on dairy. So clearly, the president was not happy with what happened. And we should say the things that the Prime Minister said in that news conference are things that he has said publicly and the Prime Minister's office says privately before. For instance, the idea that these tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum are insulting. Justin Trudeau said that last week on an interview that aired on Meet the Press on an American news network. Obviously, Donald Trump and the people around him weren't watching if they took such umbrage to what was said yesterday, but they are paying attention now, and listen to what Peter Navarro, White House trade advisor, had to say in response this morning on Fox News.
There's a special place in hell for any foreign leader that engages in bad faith diplomacy with President Donald J. Trump and then tries to stab him in the back on the way out the door. And that's what bad faith Justin Trudeau did with that stunt press conference. That's what weak, dishonest Justin Trudeau did. And that comes right from Air Force One. And I'll tell you this, to my friends in Canada, that was one of the worst political miscalculations of a Canadian leader in modern Canadian history.
So, special place in hell, Michael. Some pretty strong language, and that was not the end of it, certainly. And you heard the comments from Larry Kudlow earlier, but Peter Navarro went on to say that he felt that the Canadians were planning an attack on the U.S. political system. He's talking about that in terms of trade. He said the U.S. press should do a better job of covering it. He also said that Prime Minister Trudeau stuck President Trump in the back. This will not stand. And he was asked that comment specifically about the special place in hell and backstabbing. Are those comments directly from the president? He said, listen, those are my words, but that was certainly the sentiment on Air Force One.
So belligerent, inflammatory language that we're hearing from the administration and their surrogates. So where does this go?
I mean, that is really the big question. Obviously, this is not just a feeling that the president has, but one that is shared by his surrogates. It was interesting to note that Larry Kudlow did say on CNN that part of the reason all this is happening right now is because the president is heading to North Korea to have those talks, sorry, not to North Korea, but to Singapore to have those talks with Kim Jong-un, and that the president couldn't be seen as being weak or anything like that at this particular moment. But the anger towards Canadians is really unprecedented in terms of this relationship. The president did also talk about the potential for more trade, essentially another trade threat going forward, that autos might be the next sector he's targeting. So the economic consequences could be very real. But of course, as we always say with Donald Trump, it's hard to predict. We're going to have to wait and watch.
We're into an unprecedented place, arguably, although there have been lows in Canada-U.S. relations and personal relations between prime ministers and presidents before, perhaps going back to Kennedy-Diefenbaker. But this has massive and far-reaching consequences, as was alluded to, when it comes to a further escalation of trade and sanctions and tariffs. Not to mention some of the other important files that we can't lose sight of, including North American security and how this could ripple into NATO, arguably, because the president has a tendency to connect all things to get his way. Some of the language is almost like what you would expect in a wrestling confrontation, and some of the interviews that we see on television. It is not befitting, I would suggest, of the relationship that is so critically important for countries, for industries, for everyone involved. I suspect, Michael, that some of this, and it was alluded to by Larry Kudlow, may relate to the anxiety that the president may be feeling going into this meeting with Kim Jong-un, and his volcanic reaction is certainly disproportionate, as was discussed. These are not statements that Prime Minister Trudeau hasn't made before and hasn't made quite publicly over several days.
Well, let me jump in on that, Peter, though, because, you know, the volcanic is a great way to describe Donald Trump's reaction to it. And then we see his surrogates in the U.S. picking up where the U.S. president left off. But did Justin Trudeau, did the Prime Minister actually say anything wrong? The Prime Minister's office, as we heard, says that nothing was expressed that was not said face-to-face with the U.S. president behind closed doors. And he was essentially speaking out in favor of Canadian trade interests. Did he do anything wrong there?
Well, it seems that the president has taken some umbrance to perhaps the manner in which this occurred, as opposed to the specific language. He spoke of meek and mild, and then somehow this being a betrayal, and the timing of the press conference. And I come back to this meeting that he's headed off to. He does not want to in any way demonstrate weakness. He doesn't want to suggest any sort of position where the U.S. is supplicant to any other country. He's made this linkage, or at least his surrogates have, Larry Kudlow in particular. But no, I saw nothing in that press conference that hasn't already been stated. I think there was an element of playing to the audience, playing to the domestic audience, and I suggest that some will be criticizing the cost of this particular summit versus what were the outcomes, because clearly some of the other discussions, important as they may be, were not advanced because of the Bigfoot of President Trump coming in and making this all about him and all about trade.
And leaving before the summit was completely done. So that said, Peter, you know, as a former Minister of Foreign Affairs in this country, how should Canada move forward with this administration, with these issues?
Well, my suggestion would be more of the same when it comes to reaching out to other important actors here, whether they be state governors, whether they be heads of Chamber of Commerce, whether they be individuals who represent trade sectors in the United States, particularly in auto, particularly in steel, aluminum, agriculture. Having those face-to-face relationships and having that continuity is the cornerstone of Canada-U.S. relations. And so we need to see more of that because the volatility of this relationship now appears to be hitting new lows, and we need to be able to rely on others as well to keep the discussion going. We saw reaction from Senator McCain, Pelosi, and others. We need to continue to have friends in Congress, friends at the House of Representatives. I think we have to keep that particular line of communication open at as many levels and in as many states as possible.